Muy buenas tardes a todos y bienvenidos. Yo sé que esta es, no voy a decir mala hora, iba a decir incluso pésima hora, pero bueno, os agradezco a todos los que habéis asistido a ver esta magnífica ponencia que va a tener lugar ahora mismo, ¿no? Esta ponencia va a versar principalmente entre la conexión, una directa conexión que hay entre la salud y el medio ambiente, que yo creo que todos aprendimos mucho más de ella a partir de esta terrible pandemia del COVID que hemos tenido durante estos 3 últimos años, ¿no? Para ello contamos con la inestimable presencia de CATHARINE, que nos va a acompañar en este viaje a lo largo de estos 3/4 de hora, que es una persona que tiene un currículum tan extenso como envidiable, ¿no? e impresionante, ¿no? Es doctora en Arquitectura del Paisaje por la Universidad de Edimburgo, licenciada en Botánica y Geografía Medioambiental por la Universidad de Southampton y miembro del Instituto de Paisajismo. Ocupa ahora mismo el puesto de profesora de Arquitectura del Paisaje y directora del Centro de Desarrollo de OPENSPACE de la Universidad de Edimburgo, donde nos enseña y desarrolla temas tan interesantes como el acceso inclusivo a diferentes entornos medioambientales y la conexión entre la salud y el paisaje. Todo esto incluye trabajos con niños, jóvenes y mayores. Recibió en 2014 el Premio del Consejo Europeo de Arquitectura del Paisaje y tiene más de 100 publicaciones. Sin más dilación, doy paso a nuestra ponente. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. And I see I'm wearing the same clothes as I did in the photograph, so you can recognize me. Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's a great honour to be invited to your lovely city to share some of my work and learn from you about the exciting work you're doing. I'm a landscape architect originally, so I'm interested in planning, design and management of the environment open to the sky. Anything out there we call the potential domain of landscape architecture. But I also direct Open Space Research Centre, as has been said, which focuses on inclusive access to outdoor environments. Now, the work that I do, a lot of it focuses on health, and one of the interesting things is that the World Health Organization sees the UN Sustainable Development Goals as the best way of developing public health. So, if we think about linking good health and well-being and sustainable cities and communities, and we think about climate action and life on land, then these come together to produce an environment for our urban dwellers, in this case, that supports good health and well-being. And just one of the goals for sustainable cities and communities that's highlighted there, 11.7, talks about providing universal access to safe, inclusive and accessible green and public spaces, in particular for women, children, older persons and persons with disabilities. Well, that's the vast majority of us, isn't it? So it's very important. And I think understanding this in the context of the socio-ecological model is helpful, just to see what a shift in thinking this represents for health and the traditional clinical focus of health, which is on the individual. And many of us, if not all of us, are very grateful for that focus on us as individuals in health. But actually, what influences our health is not only our individual characteristics and what we eat and drink or what medicines we take, but also all of those arching things around us. Now, in landscape architecture and in architecture and planning, that darker blue rainbow are the areas where we think we can most readily have an influence on activities that happen in the built environment and the natural environment. We also now know, sadly, that we can influence the global ecosystem, and indeed we have. So all of that matters. It's complicated, but we have an opportunity there to see ways of thinking about health, not as treating illness, as has been said by many wonderful speakers this morning, but by supporting good health. Now, this is new, and all of you who are planners and managers of parks will know very well that in the 19th century, the urban park movement was developed in large part to address health problems of the working people that thronged into the cities under the Industrial Revolution. So in England, in Scotland, and in many parts of Europe, people were coming into the cities, but were living in very cramped and very polluted conditions. And urban parks, often originally royal parks, were seen as the lungs of the city, places that offered health. And there are some lovely early reports from Parliament in London that talk about the development of Victoria Park in the East End of London. There were nice parks in the West End where the rich people lived, the old royal parks. But there weren't so many parks in the East End where the poor people lived, who were doing much of the hard work. So there was an idea to develop a park in the East End to diminish the annual deaths by several thousand and add several years to the lives of the entire population. Now, what's interesting is in the 21st century public health language, we talk about quality-adjusted life years. We talk about exactly the same potential benefits from things like green space and parks. And the other quote there, which is nice, just gives you a flavor of the artisans, the working people, and how their health could be enhanced, and that of their families, by inhaling the fresh air at least once a week. They may only get one day off on a Sunday, at a distance from their own confined and wretched habitations. So these people were living in very miserable conditions, but a public park was seen to be of potential benefit. The illustration is actually from Birkenhead Park in northwest England, outside Liverpool, one of the first public parks bought. The land was bought by public money to build a public park for public access. And we've had many North American presenters this morning, and you will know, and they will know very well, Frederick Law Olmsted, a pioneer of landscape architecture, working with an English architect, Calvert Vaux. Very interestingly, he and his firm developed ideas about the benefits of public parks that were remarkably similar to 20th and 21st century understandings of the psychology. Olmsted thought that the artificial conditions of the town would produce a harmful effect, first on a man's entire mental and nervous system, and ultimately on his entire constitutional organization. Very, very astute. And the antidote is pleasing rural scenery. And this quote, again, is remarkably prescient of 21st century environmental psychological understandings of how the natural environment might enhance our health. Talking about a restorative landscape that engages the mind without fatigue, yet exercises it, tranquilizes it, and yet enlivens it, and thus, through the influence of the mind over the body, gives the effect of refreshing rest and reinvigoration to the whole system. The illustration here is Prospect Park in Brooklyn, considered to be one of the prime examples of good design by Olmsted and Vaux in their early partnership. This is early days of the park. You can see some of the planting is very young there. Now, more recent work, and I should say I'm a landscape architect. I'm very fortunate to work with a big team of very clever people from a range of disciplines. I work with health geographers, with epidemiologists, with psychologists, with sociologists, with anthropologists, and so on. So when I talk about work that we do in open space, please understand that it's with a great team of other very clever people, of which I'm only a very small part. This is based partly on a paper by a colleague, Rich Mitchell, who works in Glasgow, that underlines what we learned this morning. We know that green space is salutogenic. That means it enhances health, it supports good health, rather than being pathogenic or obesogenic, things that damage our health. But it's also equigenic. We know, sadly, in our modern society today, it shouldn't be so, but it still is, that one of the biggest predictors of how long you live and how healthy you are is your socioeconomic status. And the richer you are, the better your health is, and the poorer, the lower your status, the worse your health is. But green space near levels that disadvantage a little bit. So it reduces the inequalities between rich and poor, and that's very important in current policy. Now, I'm not going to spend a long time on this because you've had many wonderful presentations this morning going over much of this area, but just to remind us, why do we think having green space and parks near where we live and work makes a difference? Well, we're almost all of us more active outdoors than indoors. That's certainly true of children. It's true of many of us. And by far the most common thing that people do when they're in a park is walk. So physical activity is very likely to happen in a park, and that's good for our health. But we also know that physical activity is good for our stress. It helps us manage our stress, so it's good for our mental health as well. And it can lighten our mood. Social engagement, again, has been mentioned this morning. We know that informal social contact in natural environments can be enhanced, and just being able to say hello to neighbours or smile at someone, we may not know their name, we may never visit them in their house, but there is a social contact there, and those links can be very important to reduce social isolation. As we get older, many of us may end up living on our own, particularly if we're women, and social isolation is an independent health risk factor. So if we can reduce social isolation, and we all know under the COVID epidemic how horrible social isolation can be, through healthy use of public parks, that can be a really important contribution to supporting our health. We've already had a wonderful description of attention restoration theory, so I won't say anything more about that, but just underline the idea of soft fascination, the effortless attention that the natural environment, leaves fluttering in the breeze, the light coming through the trees, the sound of water or birds, engages us in a way that's effortless, and that's very good for restoration. And then a whole range of responses that probably relate to the biophilia theory we heard first thing this morning, independent psychophysiological responses, and a whole range of tests and research have been undertaken recently to show a number of different responses in our physiological functioning to the natural environment that suggests we are adapted as animals to being in favourable, non-threatening landscapes in a way that supports good health. And everything from parasympathetic nerve activity, rest and digest as opposed to fight or flight mode, and immune functioning seem to be supported by being in natural environments. Now, we all are interested in design and the physical environment, and these are just a few examples from our work with Forestry Commission in Scotland, looking at how design can deter or attract users. The two examples on the left are, in one case, signposted, in one case not, but they are paths through woodlands. But if you'd never been there before, if you were on your own, you're a woman feeling a bit nervous about your safety, would you feel very keen to go there? Maybe not, whereas the two images on the right are, by their design alone, welcoming. I particularly love the rightmost example, because that lovely ramp down into the woodland says, you're welcome here. You're welcome if you're a wheelchair user, or if you have a buggy with a child in it. You're welcome in here. It will be easy for you. So design alone can do wonders. Design and information can add to it, of course, as well. And another example from North America again, Prospect Park, this lovely tunnel underneath the carriage road that goes around the outside of the park, that aptly green light that reflects on the wood in the tunnel lures you into that green space at the other end of the tunnel. It's very attractive, it looks wonderful, it looks welcoming. And a little bit about some of the research we've been involved with has involved looking at biological pathways. And one of the things we've been learning to understand better is that stress is not just about mental well-being, but actually stress can damage us physiologically, physically as well. So chronic stress in particular can lead to wear and tear on our bodies and can lead to poor cardiovascular health, among other things. And we were delighted, indeed rather surprised, that we found we could predict chronic stress patterns in participants living in Scotland in very deprived areas, people out of work, looking for work, so not much money, living in deprived communities. We could predict their stress patterns by how much green space there was around their home. It was a slightly different pattern for men and for women, but using salivary cortisol and looking at the pattern of cortisol across the day, we could see healthier patterns in both men and women who had more green space around where they lived rather than less. Now, I should say all of the references that I'm showing on the slides here are also in the paper that I believe is published in your proceedings. So if you're interested in following up on any of this, you should be able to find all the references and the papers. What we also found is that there are links with lower stress and other aspects of well-being as well. And this is part of trying to understand these pathways with these links. How is it that more green space near where we live makes a difference to our well-being, lowers our stress or lowers the evidence of chronic stress? Well, it might be that we feel we belong to a place that has nice parks and green space near where we live. This is a place I belong. I fit in here. I feel this place is home. We know that place belonging predicts lower stress, and there is evidence that this might be a pathway, a significant pathway, by which more green space leads to lower stress. We also know that gardening, whether your own garden or a shared allotment, is good, and again we found evidence that this predicted lower stress and was linked with place belonging and social connectedness. So we're starting to see possible pathways and multiple links between different dimensions of well-being and lower stress. Other mechanisms, just important to remind ourselves that although we know that too much sun can be bad for us, too little can be bad for us as well, particularly when you live in Scotland. We need access to sunlight to produce vitamin D. That's very important for us, for the health of our bones, particularly us women as we get older. We need to maintain strength in our bones. If we've had children, if we were breastfeeding, as a parent, as a mother. So at all ages, in fact, access to sunlight is good for our health, and having places where we can do that in a way that is attractive, easy, pleasurable is very important for us throughout our lives. Green space and reduced air pollution. Again, we are becoming aware all over again of how much we are damaging our health by the amount of vehicles on our roads, in our cities, and how important it is to have better air quality and reduce air pollution. And we know that green space can help. It needs to be carefully designed, but it can help reduce exposure to air pollution. This references to a pan-European study looking at that. The urban heat island, again, you don't need to be reminded about climate change and the challenges of heat, particularly in summer months at night, which can be lethal, particularly for us as we get older. And having access to green space reduces the ambient air temperature in any case, but it also allows us to be in spaces which are cooler, ideally places which are free to access, free to enjoy, cool, calm space, even in the heat of summer. We've done a lot of work with older people and over many years, and qualitative and quantitative. And as I get older myself, I am reminded of just how important it is to get out at any age, to get outdoors and enjoy the natural environment if you want to maintain good health. And some of the quotes we have from our older participants remind us about how important it is just to get outdoors. Again, we really noticed this under COVID, didn't we? A load comes off my mind when I go out. I have a different feeling about myself when I get home after being out. And in particular, engaging with nature, the seasons. I enjoy the seasons and elements of change. I like trees, wildlife, and the atmosphere. It's all stimulating for thought. How close does it need to be? Well, with a small sample, but a sample of older people in the UK, living within 10 minutes walk of their local open space meant that they were twice as likely to achieve recommended levels of healthy walking, 2.5 hours a week, as people who lived further away from a local park. And they were also more than twice as likely to be satisfied with life. So it needs to be near, really near, within 10 minutes of walk, ideally, for us to use it on a regular basis and benefit from it. And we've done some more recent work with architecture colleagues and with architecture and landscape architecture students looking at what we can do to design places with older people and for older people. And the qualities that they say really matter to them are access for all, so inclusive places, access to nature, access to others, so the social element, and access to light. Light, bright spaces matter to us even more in old age when many of us start getting worse eyesight. And we all know how the heart lifts on a beautiful, clear day when the sun shines. This is just another example of how we can design thresholds between buildings and outdoors to make it easy to get out and to get back in again and to make it non-threatening. Just an example of a park in Norway, actually, but where the low sun angle in the autumn meant that the man on the left sitting inside the shelter, there's panes of glass covering the portico. So he's sitting in the sun, but he's sheltered from the wind. That's very attractive for him. The healthy young people on the right are sitting out in the open. They're less worried about the wind. But we can design thresholds like that that allow for warm, pleasant spaces in the sun in the winter months or the months when the sun is at a lower angle and shade us in the summer months. These details of design can make a big difference to whether people feel free to go outdoors or not, and a threshold between the two, the place between indoors and outdoors and how it's designed, can make a big difference to that. We've done some work, this is very exploratory work, with mobile neuro headsets, measuring with our older participants their experience of walking in busy urban streets or in parks. This is actually one of our mature PhD students. But we had a number of very adventurous older participants who were prepared to wear this rather funny headset while going about in Edinburgh. And we compared urban green spaces, green parks, with urban quiet spaces, streets with gardens not very busy, and also with urban busy streets with shops and buses and traffic. And we looked at the difference. In this case, if you can see the difference, the blue is urban busy and the green is parks. I haven't got time to go into the detail of how we interpret these low beta patterns of neural activity, but they suggest that the park is buffering the effect of the required attentional demand when you go into a busy street, but is very restorative of that attentional demand if you come from a busy street into a park. And in brief, we think that attention restoration theory is a very good explanation for that pattern that we find in neural response to different environments. As we get older, we find that it's harder to focus attention on many things at the same time, even if we're women. And maybe our mobility is a bit more impaired. We're worried about being distracted by things. Going out into a busy urban environment can make us fearful of falling. Our bones may be less stable. We may fracture. If we fall and break a bone, then we may be very hesitant to go out again. So having places that allow us to restore our attention so we can then pay attention again to all the busy demands of urban living and the urban street can be very good for us in older age to help us get out. We've done some interesting work with a cohort of older participants, and again, I only have time to sort of touch the surface of it, but the references are in my paper, and you can get them from the proceedings afterwards if you want to follow up. So we've looked at people who were born in Scotland and who have aged over the last 10, 20 years in and around Edinburgh. This is the Lothian birth cohort. They were born in 1936. We have IQ test results from every school child in Scotland at age 11 from that cohort. And so all of our participants in their 70s and 80s, we know what their IQ test results were when they were 11, which is great because we can then compare cognitive tests in later life to cognitive tests in very early life in childhood. And then you can see there's lots of different waves of studies that have been done in their 70s and 80s, looking at a whole range of physiological measures, mapping brain tissue, all kinds of tests that these lovely volunteers agreed to undergo. But we've also, in 2014, as part of a research project that I was leading, we asked them all to fill in a life grid questionnaire to tell us where they had lived for every decade of their lives. And we then mapped the physical environment in terms of a range of things, including housing quality, air pollution, but also green space in relation to the different periods of their life. So here we're looking at maps of parks and green space in Edinburgh at different stages from 1914 onwards. And we can then, in this map, every dot is one of our birth cohort participants. We can see how close they were to a public park, in this case at 1949, so a period around the 1940s, 1950s, and we can do that for different decades of their life. One of the things we found is that we can spot significant associations, and we've seen, I haven't got time to give you all of the results, but we see changes in a range of outcome measures, whether it's cognitive, agility, frailty, mental health, or measures of biological aging like telomere length, related to physical environment and social environment throughout the life course. And there are different theories about what's going on here. Is it just exposure going on throughout life? Is it an accumulation? The more that you have for longer periods, the worse it is. Or are there critical periods in your life, times in your life when actually it matters more whether you had green space nearby or not? And the answer is that that latter is partly true. So when we look at cognitive aging, age 70 plus, we find no association with green space before 70, but we can see a marker in the statistical results from those people who in childhood had better access to public parks than people who didn't. Their decline in cognitive ability is slower in older age. And it's enhanced by access to green space throughout their adult life, and it's strongest among women and people of low socioeconomic status. And when we look at mental health, anxiety and depression, we see a similar kind of pattern, an influence of green space over the life course, limited to the most socially disadvantaged neighborhoods. So this harks back to the equigenic effect of green space, that it can reduce the difference between rich and poor, high and low status, because more green space, even in socially deprived contexts, enhances health. Access to green space in childhood makes a difference in old age to how anxious or depressed you're likely to be. Again, we can see that signal from way back in childhood in effects in old age. And for anxiety, every decade of life near more green space makes a difference in older age. So this life course of place, this influence of place throughout our lives is a really strong message, particularly when we see that it matters from childhood onwards, and that some of what we experience in older age may be reflecting the experiences from quite early childhood. And we're continuing to do research on that. I'm involved in this Advanced Care Research Centre, looking at how to find and develop environments that support people's personal projects to help them flourish and get outdoors in older age. So that's one aspect of what we do now. But we do also need to think very seriously about people who have no good childhood experience of nature or green blue space. What do we do about these? One of the slightly older bits of research I was involved with earlier on in my career with Forestry Commission in Scotland was looking at deprived communities and access to woodlands near where people lived. And we started off doing some qualitative work with focus groups. These are with unemployed men and women in central Scotland, very much a post-industrial society. And you can see from these quotes that a woodland, an attractive woodland space, allows you to go away by yourself. Nobody can see you. You don't have to worry about not being in work. You can just keep walking. It's just a place to get away from it all, really important. You don't have to have money. You don't need to be in spending, in consumer mode. I find it's quiet. It gets you away from everyday life. You just go away and be in a world of your own sometimes. If you're angry at anything, just go away and get yourself all calmed down. So relieving the stress and sometimes the anger, the frustration of unemployment, of trying to live without adequate resources. Woodland spaces can really offer that opportunity. And more recent work that we've done looked at a range of different projects enhancing woodlands near deprived communities and a range of health outcome measures. And I'm actually doing a third wave of that research right now, which is epidemiological, looking across Scotland at this. We haven't got the results yet. So I can't tell you that, but we're looking at a range of outcomes, including hospitalization for mental health difficulties and a range of prescriptions for mental health problems. But one of the things, just to point out, that's really important to remember for all of us in the room, the top and the bottom right-hand images there. The top image on the right is an estimation of how much it costs society in Scotland to have poor mental health. It's £10.7 billion. That's nearly £2,000 for every person who lives in Scotland. That's the cost to society of poor mental health. How much does it cost to enhance woodlands in a way that is likely to increase use? Well, when we were looking at projects, it was about £12 to £15 per person. Much cheaper, of a different order. So you don't need to get very much percentage change for that 12 or 15 pounds for it to be economically very worthwhile to invest if it's going to enhance even some people's mental health and well-being. Just to point you to some resources before I come to my final few messages, we've been involved with the City of Edinburgh in developing their plan for the next 30 years for Edinburgh's parks and green spaces. That was called Edinburgh's Thriving Green Spaces Project. We undertook some research. We helped them develop some logic models and think about evaluation. And the website there can give you more information if you're interested in the details of what happened there. That was undertaken over the last 2.5 years. And that project was funded as part of a UK-wide project which looked at future park development over 30 years for 8 different cities in the UK. We were the only Scottish one. The others were in England. But there's a resource there too as a result of that, the Future Parks Resource Hub, which again looks at lessons learned from these different cities coming together to think, how do we plan and manage our parks over the next 30 years in a very hard-headed context, understanding that public spending is low, that we all know that it's not just capital spend that we need for parks, it's recurrent revenue spend to manage and maintain parks. So we're facing a lot of problems in the UK, even more than perhaps you are in the rest of Europe. I won't say more. But we're not naive about the challenges facing park management and facing trying to raise interest in investing in public parks. Nonetheless, there are some lessons learned and some opportunities to make a good case to the politicians, to the councillors, for good investment for public health and social benefit return. One area, for example, we're currently working with on a project at the moment is with The Welcoming. It's an organisation in Edinburgh that welcomes what we call new Scots, people new to Scotland that include refugees and asylum seekers. And we work with them to evaluate how engaging in outdoor activities can support their health and well-being, and they're enabling them to fit into their new context. These are people with many, many challenging and difficult backgrounds. So we're also looking at homeless people and working with them again to look at how parks and green spaces can help, and activities in them can help support their health and well-being. And that's part of the Groundswell Research Consortium, which is a big consortium of researchers across the UK, working in Northern Ireland and in England as well as Scotland, looking at how urban green and blue space can reduce health inequalities and enhance public health. So it's actually primarily funded by our Medical Research Council. So it's quite nice to be involved in research on urban green and blue space, where the Medical Research Council is actually the primary funder, seeing how we can prevent non-communicable disease through urban green and blue space. And also, just to mention, we've developed a master's program in landscape and well-being. If you have anyone who's interested, we are very happy to have international students. We have a very international cohort to try and translate some of what we've learnt into teaching materials that landscape architects, but also planners, managers, environmental psychologists, people from a range of different backgrounds, you don't have to be a landscape architect, can benefit from our research. So my final few slides are summing up the big messages. I contributed to a World Health Organization publication that came out in 2016 on urban green spaces and health. That's available from WHO, the website. If you're interested in a research summary of evidence on health links to urban green space, published by WHO, then that's freely available for you to download. And again, the reference is in my paper, so you can find it if you forget now. And I was responsible for one of the chapters in that report, looking at the range of different evidences at that time, 2015-16, for links between green space and health. And then I was invited to go to the European region's meeting of advisors to health ministers in Skopje, in Macedonia, in 2016. And I was given 10 minutes to tell all those ministers in easy words why they should tell their health ministers to pay attention to green space. It was a big event with lots of other things about health being discussed, and I just had to insert this little slot that said, here's what matters about green space. So this is my attempt to do that succinctly. What types of green space does a city need? It needs to be nearby. It needs to be near. If it's not within 5 to 10 minutes of where we spend our days, we're very unlikely to visit it often. And if we're going to benefit most, then several times a week visiting is important. So ideally, it's easily visible from most places. So we can look out at it, we can see it, it's easy to spot, we can find it easily. And they don't have to all be public, of course. They may be private or semi-private. There may be school gardens that are restricted just for school children, or places in care homes just for older people, or they could be shared. It's not to say that one type fits all, but they do need to be nearby. And many small private or semi-private green areas at a local scale are very important, as we know from COVID. But we also need green infrastructure networks. We need to make active transport something that's pleasurable and enjoyable, not just something that we feel we ought to do, but is really hard and unpleasant to do. And we need to be able to get to all parts of the city. Poor people, people living in deprived communities need to be able to have attractive routes to get into other parts of the city and to get to their work, as do we all. Many nice examples that I've seen here in Madrid of some active travel routes. But these need to be networks that penetrate the whole city. And of course, we need those large parks as well. We need big natural areas to support biodiversity, to support wildlife, also to allow for big social activities, whether it's sport or big family gatherings, environmental education, nature study, a place where we can get away from it all and be in the natural environment as well. Feel that we're away from the city. Where do we need it? It needs to be close to where we spend our daily lives. So it needs to be close to where you live and work and play. And our website has got a lot of resources on it, which you're very welcome to investigate if you want to look up anything further. I'm also very happy to answer questions if we have a few minutes for that. Thank you. Trying to look out to... I don't see any hands frantically waving. No. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bueno, espero que haya sido de vuestro interés y vuestro agrado toda la presentación. Parece ser que al final no ha habido ninguna cuestión para CATHARINE. Bueno, pues damos paso a la siguiente ponencia. Muchas gracias a todos.
Buenas tardes. La siguiente ponente es GAYLE SOUTER-BROWN. Es arquitecta paisajista y experta en diseño del paisaje urbano saludable. Ella, por motivos de salud, no ha podido viajar y ha realizado el esfuerzo de enviarnos su presentación para que la veamos esta tarde. Espero que todos la disfrutéis. Muchas gracias.
Buenos días. Greetings from New Zealand. My name is GAYLE SOUTER-BROWN, and I'm sorry that I'm not there with you in person in Madrid, but last month I had an accident and hit my head. I have brain injury and I'm not allowed to travel. So the alternative is that I get to present this to you remotely. So we were asked by the conference organisers to present you with our experience and some solutions. So my experiences as an academic researcher and professional practitioner, both of public health and landscape architecture, urban design, so salutogenic design, that is health promoting. The solutions that I offer then are to share this knowledge, this experience, both as a consultant advisor to government and non-governmental organisations and civic and private landowners, developers and other design professionals. We do a lot of work on a peer review basis. As a practitioner, Greenstone Design UK Limited I established in 2005, and so I am able to work that remotely. We've worked all around the world, on every continent, Antarctica. And so I run that remotely. So we design gardens, parks, playgrounds, sports grounds, everything with an emphasis on design for health and well-being, back to that salutogenic design. We'll talk more about that as we go through. And I also share my knowledge through writing. I'm an author. So I've got two examples up here on the screen for you. I wrote the textbook, Landscape and Urban Design for Health and Wellbeing Using Healing, Sensory and Therapeutic Gardens, back in 2015. So that was published by Routledge Press in London. And I wrote it as a textbook, but to be accessible so that anybody anywhere can pick it up and hopefully make sense of it. And in fact, I've had a 7-year-old who read it and asked me some searching questions. So she absolutely understood what it was all about. So I hope that if it's of interest to you, that you might follow up and find a copy of that either as an online version or in print. And the other publication that's of relevance to this presentation today is the result from my PhD study, the effects of a sensory garden on workplace wellbeing, the randomised control trial. And so that was published by Landscape and Urban Planning, the Journal of, in 2021. And so that may also be of interest to you. So why do we do all this? The background situation is that we all carry a stress load, and chronic stress affects health, well-being, and our lifestyle choices. And so while the research shows the importance of nature to reduce stress and improve health, how to design public spaces to impact those health outcomes was unclear. So the theory suggests that sensory gardens could support healthy lifestyles and apparently well people. And sensory gardens is, as a practitioner, what we've been working on for some years now. And we've been working with the 5% of the population with special needs, with diagnosed disabilities. And so my question was, what would we need to use for the 95%, the apparently well, what interventions will be put in place? And as Catherine Ward-Thompson has found, the nature connection works particularly well for socioeconomically deprived people, anybody with additional needs. And so what we distilled out of the existing research knowledge base was that the essential design elements would include perceived sensory dimensions. And that's work that's been done by Ulrika Stigsdotter and Patrick Grahn in Copenhagen. A sense of coherence, which comes from the theory of salutogenesis, Aaron Antonovsky's work. Attachment with place and ability to control a positive experience of nature were also important. So just before we go much further, I thought a glossary might be useful just to describe these terms. So this salutogenic design, we're talking about specifically health promoting. So the genesis of health. So it's a mixture of the Greek and the Latin. So that's what salutogenesis is about. It's about health promotion. The sensory garden, they started off as gardens for the blind, for the sight impaired, but they have moved so far beyond that. Now to be a space that activates and integrates the senses with abundant planting, that playful sense of discovery, challenge and opportunity. Apparently well, we're talking about the 95% of people who function without major disability. Cortisol is a stress hormone that we've measured, and again, as has Catherine Ward-Thompson, perceived stress is how stressed a person thinks they are. So cortisol is a physiological marker that, regardless of how you think you are, it will tell you what the situation actually is. So we've measured cortisol, we've measured the perceived stress, and then we've also measured perceived well-being, which we've measured on the flourishing scale. So just some terms for you there. So the research that I conducted for my PhD was a randomized controlled trial. Like trialing a new drug, we had 2 intervention groups and a control, and we had 165 participants between the ages of 18 and 65, and they were from 50 different nationalities and cultural backgrounds. And so I was interested in, could we find something that had some sort of universal effect? And so what we did by way of the intervention was the 2 intervention groups for the plaza and the sensory garden were each given 30 minutes once a week for 4 weeks into either the plaza or the sensory garden. So the image here is the plan of the sensory garden. It's about 900 square meters, which is a comparable size space to the existing plaza, which was on one side of the library building there on the university campus, and the sensory garden was developed on existing grass with some mature trees, whereas the plaza was developed, was an established space with predominantly hard paving with trees with seating. It was mixed methods research, which meant that we were able to measure quantitatively changes over time, pre and post intervention, in the salivary cortisol, perceived stress, perceived well-being, productivity. And we were also able to measure, sorry, not measure, but to to gain an understanding of how people felt about the space and what changes, what effects it may have had on them. And we did that through one-on-one interviews and focus groups and open-ended questionnaires where people just told, they shared their experience with us. And so we were able to glean information about diet and exercise and sociability. So the findings, participants in the sensory garden group had an almost 20% reduction in their cortisol levels, which is statistically significant, but it's also practically significant. The average cortisol got when people go out and experience a standard design park or garden is about a 5% reduction in cortisol, which is good, but we had an almost 4 times that average. So there's this concentrated dose of nature, if you will, within the sensory garden, and almost 10% gain in perceived well-being, which we measured here on the flourishing scale, almost 5% gain in perceived output, work output being the productivity. And then we used visits to green space as a proxy for physical activity. So people were motivated, people here in the garden group motivated to go outside and actively sought out more experiences. And they went walking, they took their family, they took their friends out into parks and gardens. And then their perceived stress levels. Now, this was an interesting one, not statistically significant, but people felt so much better after they'd been in the sensory garden, and they felt so much worse after they'd been in the plaza. Fascinating. So from the one-on-one interviews and the focus groups, people also told us about their improved lifestyle. So they ate more mindfully. They chose healthy foods. They had enhanced problem solving. Their overall cognitive function was improved, their memory, their decision making. They had increased nature connection. They reduced the use of recreational drugs. Fascinating. So what do we do with all this information? Well, the summary of it all as such, the sense of the theories were confirmed, and what was important to participants were 5 things. So the serenity was important. Natural materials, nature was important. Being outdoors, even for people in the plaza, they commented that just being outdoors for 30 minutes once a week felt fantastic. That was all really that the plaza offered them, but that was important to them. And then the richness of species and a sense of refuge were what was really noted within the participants in the sensory garden group. And so those 5 things, to me, were summarized within this sort of snore idea. And I chose snore because it was fun, and because there's a sense of a space that makes you feel so relaxed, so safe that you can sleep. As this participant is doing here on the beanbag, this is in the middle of a busy university campus. It was extraordinary. And people would come in carrying all the stress of having had a difficult meeting or a tricky assignment or whatever it might have been, and they would just decompress as they walked into the garden within moments and could then sleep. Some people slept every session, some people slept occasionally. It was totally based on their need, their mood at the time, what was going on in their lives, but they felt they could. So the space overall where people could sleep, where they could snore. So that's the design framework. But there's no point in having a design framework without having a way of managing a space. That ongoing, enduring management of the space is what makes it actually function. And so MICO was my acronym for that management. So SNORMICO, I'd like to unpack a bit more for you now to go through those component parts. So the S of the snore, serene. The space was beautiful, it was green, it was quiet. which meant that although the university backs onto a motorway, in the plaza, it was quite obvious, the road noise, the traffic noise. But in the sensory garden, the bird song, we'd planted specifically to attract more songbirds. And we had moving water from a small waterfall, distracted from the road noise. So you could still hear it, but you didn't notice it, which is an interesting design technique. It was open space, so that feeling of being able to spread out, feeling of feeling safe, and a place to relax. So these are all images from the garden, from the sensory garden. Nature, natural materials, it's a little bit wild, it's a little bit messy. And this becomes this metaphor for life, where life is beautiful, but it's always changing. And there's growth and decay, and it's allowed to be on show in the sensory garden. So that we know, we borrow from psychology, that people who are in environments where they have set predictability and it's a very structured environment that they're in, if anything changes, it comes as a shock to the system. Whereas when you are exposed to environments like the sensory garden, where you see the natural processes of life playing out, when something happens in life, you become more adaptable and flexible, as is normal, as is natural within life. The use of the natural materials here, we have a shell chip, crushed shell. It's a coastal campus, so it was appropriate to use the shell. We also have over here in a woodland area under the existing mature trees, bark chip on the paths. And then we have timber sleepers. So this side is wheelchair accessible. Over this side, we have a mindfulness path. We have to navigate the space. You've only got a 2 centimetre drop if you do sort of fall off it. But it was interesting as we were laying it out, noticing that you have to concentrate. You can't think about anything else. Everything else goes from your mind while you work out how to navigate the route. Fascinating. So these natural materials are porous, so they absorb those extreme rainfall events. So we've got a sustainable urban drainage scheme happening here within the sensory garden. We've got increased planting, which then absorbs carbon. And we've got the extra tree canopy cover, which also then produces the urban greenhouse effect. So allowing death and decay was an interesting one that the research participants didn't expect to see. It's not normal as such to have things sort of rotting away in the corner. Allowing those decomposers to do their work. So when we had some tree trimmings, to leave them in a pile in the corner, became habitat for all sorts of invertebrate life, and then also fungi growing. And so it became this very natural, very changeable, flexible space. That it was outdoors was significant. Outdoors provides the best effect. So we know that indoor atriums absolutely have a place as do indoor plants, but for the full sensory benefit, the full experience of rain on your face, wind in your hair, it needs to be outdoors for that real deep therapeutic effect. The space, the sensory garden was rich in species, is rich in species. It's, we know that for human health and well-being, we need to have those healthy ecologies, that combination of healthy soils, plants, waters, the animals. We have a biodiversity crisis internationally, and we've got an opportunity to address that within our urban parks and gardens. Planting for birds, for pollinators, for seasonal variation is a very important part of what we're doing in terms of designing these therapeutic spaces for human health and well-being. I mentioned water here. Also, water is essential for all life. And we had that with a pond and a little stream and a waterfall here within the garden, which then meant that we had extra movement, extra life. We had some goldfish. And it's just that sense of further animating the space, bringing it to life. And there was also the second bar of snore, the sense of refuge, that sense of safety and enclosure. And here we created it with brush screening initially. The research budget was small, but this whole 900 square metre space was developed for about 10,000 euros. And in comparison, the plaza space cost about 125,000 euros approximately. And so that sense of value for money that you get from the health benefits of this space, which is good for people, good for the planet, has an economic upside as well. But back to the sense of refuge. Perimeter planting, contouring the land, where you could have people sitting on this side of an earth mound, and that side not being able to see each other. If they stood up, they could, but while they were seated, they felt like they were in a world of their own. And likewise here, this person sat with her back to an arrangement of logs. And there was that sense of something being at your back. The other side that's important for the sense of refuge is to have a view out, that sense of prospect, which is achieved by angling the space out towards a view and openings and planting so that people can see and you can see out, but you are tucked away. So that's the snore side of things. The management side of it now is this MICO, M-I-C-O. And so the M is for maintenance. Maintenance needs to be organic. This is no place for pesticides and herbicides. We've often found as practitioners, we go in, we're asked to design a space because there's capital budget available, but then there is frequently no operating budget available to maintain it on an ongoing basis. And so what becomes important, as it was here with the sensory garden at the university, was to design a space without any need for technical knowledge, so non-specialised labour, so that you could have community volunteers, friends of the garden group, carry out the day-to-day maintenance with oversight from the estates team. So that easy care maintenance, as in New York with the Skyline Garden, it's a model that works particularly well. And it works nicely in terms of the ripple effect out into the community. That benefit is then extended. So not just the people who are directly in the space, but their contacts wider out into the community. So maintenance. I for interaction. Being allowed to interact with a space was found to be important for that overall stress reduction, health therapeutic benefit. So whether it's being allowed to pick flowers, so we planted an abundance of wildflowers that could be picked for posies and were taken indoors into the various offices and taken home. And we also planted fruit and vegetables and herbs that again could be picked, eaten on the spot. Being allowed to play in the water, being able to dig in the sand, in the soil, or being allowed to climb trees. And as this young chap, he'd never climbed a tree in his life before, and he's in his early 20s. And he came in on this particular session into the sensory garden, and he was walking quite stiffly, quite stressed, obviously stressed, and walked around, explored the space, and then stopped at the base of the tree. And I was sitting over behind, and he turned to me and he said, "Are you allowed to climb the trees?" And I said, "Yes, of course." And so up he went as high as you could possibly go. And then he turned and he said to me, "I've never climbed a tree before, look at me." And it was that sense of delight that being allowed to get in amongst and interact with nature in a whole new way that had a particular effect. And it's not to say that he climbs a tree every day, but being allowed to And then from a design point of view, having low branching trees that are easily accessible becomes then part of those design decisions. The C of Maiko, control, that sense of control. If your life is feeling out of control, being able to do something as simple as choose to sit in the sun or the shade, choose to sit in a formal chair or on a beanbag, choose to sit somewhere on your own or cluster the seats together to sit with a group of friends. Those are all small things that you can take control of that then have an effect on your overall sense of well-being and an overall effect on your stress levels. So it's a small thing, but again, being able to manage a space to allow this sense of control is important for that overall well-being effect. Oh, the final part of this Stormyco, that sense of ownership. People talked about having their space. This is my space, my seat, my time. And that plays out in different ways in different places. And these two photos here are not from my centre garden, but international examples. The first one here on the left is a birdhouse that I saw when I visited a client in Moscow. And people were allowed to make their own birdhouses, bird feeders, and paint them, and then supply the food for their birdhouses. So they were out there in the woods, in the urban forest, with their birdhouse on their tree as such. And it was that sense of ownership that people got, they gained from being allowed to do so. So a simple thing from a management of a public space point of view, but profound in terms of its effect on the individual. This example here on the right was from Berlin, where people are living in apartments up above the street. This particular area was developed by a lady who lived upstairs. And so the existing street tree was here. And what she did was she erected a small fence. So it's about 30 centimetres tall. It's not big at all, with a small gate. And the perimeter planting to the space, a seat, an arbour, a little birdhouse. It's a little bit messy, a little bit wild. There are fallen leaves, but it's her space. And it's that sense again of being allowed to create your own space, to go out to prune shrubs, to deadhead flowers, to create that sense of ownership is what creates this effect. So relatively easily done, but it's knowing what to do and where to do it, where those opportunities lie. That's really the key to it. So some other considerations are playfulness was found to be really important, both for adults, we know it is for children, and we forget that sometimes, but playfulness is also important for adults. And whether they were digging in the sand, so over at the back here of this image, you can see a plastic children's bucket, as in bucket and spade for the seaside. And so we supplied buckets and spades, and so they could build sandcastles. So there was all sorts of artistic creating work going on from time to time. Not always, and it was interesting to see some days people were in need of getting into the sand and digging. Other days they created something and they smashed it down. Other times they came in, they brought the guitar and they just sat in the corner and played. So that space, having the ability to be able to be playful is also important. CIPDED, crime prevention through environmental design. The theory says that you need straight, clear sight lines through. And so crown lifted trees and cleared shrub and all that lower level. But the same theory goes that the design that reduces the stress levels of the good people also works on the bad people, as it were. So when you've got, it's to be rather monochromatic, everybody, this universal effect says that it works for everybody. And so the antisocial behavior is mitigated by reducing the stress. So we're not saying that we're taking away poverty, that we're taking away injustice. But what we're doing is we're giving people an opportunity to manage their stress loads so that they can find more effective ways of dealing with stress in their lives than some of the antisocial behaviors and the lifestyle choices, the self-destructive behaviors that they had been entering into previously. So really interesting. Which brings me to accreditation, which I think could be useful to be able to say that this space is designed according to this framework. And we could say then that it meets these criteria for serenity, for species richness, for a sense of refuge, whatever it might, all those 8 key criteria. And when it does, give it the health tick. So we'll need some more work on this, but it's an area that I think will be valuable. So I welcome your feedback on how we would work through this accreditation system, which then leads me to this final slide, which is, please do get in touch. If I was there with you now, we'd now go off and we'd have a cup of coffee, we might have a glass of wine, whatever it might be, to discuss further your interpretation of this presentation. So SNOR-MECO, SNOR being the design framework, MECO being that management framework, together SNOR-MECO, gives us that toolbox, if you like, of how we can design public space for health and well-being. And you people as academics, as practitioners, I welcome your input to say, what further information would you need to be able to make it work for you? What else do we need within this framework, if anything? Maybe we've got it all here. What I'd like to be able to do is for you to send me your feedback. If you can email it to me, that would be great. If we want to set up a Zoom meeting, we can do that too. And then I'll be able to incorporate your feedback into the final design and management framework that we will then publish in the coming months. So I welcome your feedback. Thank you very much again to the conference organisers for the opportunity to present to you today, and I hope you enjoyed the rest of the conference. Gracias.
Bueno, pues con esto se termina la tarde, las conferencias que se han desarrollado. Esperamos que os hayan gustado y bueno, que mañana os esperamos aquí para seguir con el resto de conferencias del día. Muchas gracias a todos por asistir y os esperamos mañana.